Hello and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Rob Ede, who is, I'd say, lead contributor, lead on Actix Web. So it's great to have you on. Do you mind to kind of give a quick intro and then we'll spin off to start our questions?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, my name's Rob. I go by Rob JTEDE on Twitter, wherever. I grew up in a small town near Manchester in the UK. I did my degree at the University of Sheffield and then moved to London for work, which is where I am now.
What brought you to London, though? Is it just the job asked you to come over here, or was it
Yeah,
working with Rust?
The work was. It was an office job, so I had to move down a bit earlier than I was sort of expecting, but it turned out to be a good gig, so...
Now, when you say office job, it's not shoveling paperwork. It's actually doing coding. I just want to make sure what you mean by office work.
Yeah, I guess in the current context of everybody doing remote work, it was very much a come into an office and do programming kind of thing. It was a small team, so it was nice to have the small environment to work with.
What kind of programming language or frameworks and stuff like that were you actually working on at the time?
Right, so when I started, this was back in 2018, I hired for a front-end role for this financial startup that then got acquired by the company I'm working for now. Throughout the time since, my roles shifted to full stack and then to back end when I sort of realized that trying to keep up with advancements in front end and back end simultaneously was exhausting. So now I'm majority Rust. Of course, at the time we were using a lot of Java.
So I'm actually kind of curious now, was the startup that you were at, were they actually switching to Rust and then got acquired, or did this change to Rust happen afterwards?
No, I think I sort of brought Rust onto the table when I was doing my full stack stuff. We were having problems with Java because it was kind of old and already some of the team had already left. It was bloated and all the things you associate with enterprise level sort of Java apps. But we wanted to break up the monolith that was built. I suggested something and it was accepted, and then we suddenly had Rust in our stack.
So when you guys started bringing Rust in, like what kinds of libraries were you working with? Because was this like how Actix came onto your radar, or what were you guys working with?
Right, yeah. It's really web service is what we sort of exposed to the public. So the part that I was proposing we change was the authentication part, like extracting that out of the monolith. So I was looking for a web framework in Rust, and Actix popped up at the time. There wasn't really too many other options. There was sort of Iron, and I think Rocket was getting going. But Actix looked nice. It was sort of version 0.7, so back when it was based on actors, and that was sort of interesting to me. I was trying to learn about that stuff and expose a reasonably nice interface compared to the others, so it fit our purposes quite nicely.
Can we talk about your first experience with Actix Web? I mean, was it just like totally difficult for you to follow, or because I feel like when I work with Actix Web or some of these other ones, it's really kind of bare bones. You're kind of bringing stuff together and takes a little bit of effort, like Rocket or these kind of batteries included kind of frameworks.
Yeah, the thing I was building, obviously this authentication system didn't really need a lot of bells and whistles, so I was looking for a micro framework, I guess is the terminology you'd use there. So something akin to Flask or Sinatra in Ruby. And I'd done a lot of work with Node.js in the past, so I wanted something that kind of had that, no real bells and whistles, but was fast and a nice API for what we did need it for.
It's interesting that you worked with Node.js before, because when I work with Express or these other ones, I feel like I'm almost back working with Rust again because I have to assemble everything myself, which to me, I feel really annoyed.
Yeah, I think that comes probably with having a great third-party library ecosystem, which I think both Rust and Node do, right? So you can assemble things together pretty reliably without having to rely on janky package management.
Yeah, but I mean, some of the parallels with their problems for me, I think, in Node.js are similar with Rust, where it's like you pull in one package and you get a bunch of others. So it's kind of like that reference where it's like, okay, I wanted a banana, but now I have a banana with a gorilla holding on to it, plus the rest of the jungle a little bit sometimes, especially like that whole entire like left pad issue, right? It's a little bit scary if that ever happens to Rust. I think that would be a huge issue, but hopefully it will be okay.
Yeah, the left pad was definitely a bad time. We
don't talk about that, right?
Had nothing to do with that. Yeah, again, my original role was front end, so I had a lot of experience with JavaScript, and the selling point of Node was like it's the same language on both front and back end. So that's how I got into that kind of stuff. But it became clear, like as you say, there's quite a lot of bloat with small standard libraries.
Yeah, I think the what you're trying to say is that there's always this idea within, not even with Rust, but with JavaScript that like, okay, you make a packages for this one function or these few key functions and then just reuse it. But
Hmm.
the other thing that if I remember correctly, the way Node.js works is like you can actually have multiple versions of the same package because they're dependent on different versions and they have a way that they can mitigate this problem. But Rust actually doesn't do that if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't remember the details, but it feels sort of from just experience like the way that Rust does deduplication of stuff is nicer. I guess partly because it needs to do it in a better way to have the type system work out right, or else you'd get conflicting types. Whereas in dynamic languages, it doesn't matter if the shape is the same. It's all good to go.
It's like basically going back to duck typing, right?
Right, yeah. So yeah, they share that, and they sort of at this point share the fact that they don't have very popular, super high level frameworks with like batteries included stuff. We're talking about Rails and Django here, right? We don't have an equivalent for that yet. And when I left the sort of Node ecosystem, they didn't really have a competitor for that either.
It's a very hard thing to do because you have to make a lot of decisions, and
Mm.
when you start to combine all this stuff, it's like, oh, that's you're gonna be hurting some people. I think the difference with Rails at least was like, I think the one guy built everything himself, and at the time the Ruby was just not popular, so it was kind of like, okay, well these things are okay, and then I think when he opened up and let people work with him, then I think they made it better, and then merging with Marub. Anyways, this is kind of delving into a whole another
Yeah.
ecosystem, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I guess the point is we don't really have that, and I think that's fine for now. Like maybe we'll never really have something that is has batteries included and has everything like Rails, although people talk about it a lot. So from that point of view, I'm happy with where Actix Web is right now. I don't think I'm targeting it to become that ever.
yeah, I think that's a great plan. But then I think you have to start, in order to make maximum compatibility of this kind of stuff, you'd have to start making like interfaces. Like you can say, okay, this is the interface. If you can work with that, then you can be included, right? So like there's different types of templating languages and things like
Mm,
that.
exactly.
So I guess that's kind of where you need to be, right? But hopefully if we start to work on this kind of problem, that it's not going to be like, sorry, what is it? The futures ecosystem where it's, or sorry, the async ecosystem where even though there's some type of common interface, they still end up kind of diverging enough that you can't just swap them out.
Yeah, and that's especially true in Rust, where you need to pick an interface, pick a trait to win. Right? There's currently one features trait, which is great, and that was a real breakthrough in the language. But right now, we still have multiple stream traits or async read traits that we really need to get condensed down to one thing and have it in the standard library before it's widely adopted. And the same is true of higher level things as well. Like you basically got to pick a winner for every level of the stack. An easy sort of example to point to at a more high level is Rocket's templating engine. They've picked a winner, right? That's the one you use with Rocket versus the more micro framework approach where you can pick whichever one you want. And at that level, it kind of works that you can just pick whichever one you want. It doesn't need to be built in.
I kind of want to go back to you guys' first experience. So actually,
Mm.
what kind of got you into Rust to begin with? Because that's really, I know the Node community is starting to adopt Rust in some places. I think, I forgot what it was, but I think some pieces of NPM I think are written in Rust, which is pretty
Mm.
exciting. What got you looking at Rust?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was sort of aware of it when it came on the scene 2016, maybe it was gaining some traction. It didn't really have a viable use case in my life at the point. I was sort of aware of it and I tried it out at a hackathon once and kind of liked it for writing some algorithms, although obviously at the time it was kind of tricky to write some of these algorithms in a more traditional way. But then it really was at work researching these web framework alternatives that I started using it sort of properly full time.
And how did you feel when you first started with it? Was it like a relationship where you're fighting the barrel checker and it's fighting you, or?
It was rough. Yeah, for sure. I think everyone certainly it's come a long way, but the guys who've been writing Rust since 2018 will remember the pre 2018 edition days, right? There were a lot of sharp edges. Is how I like to explain it, and especially with like the async ecosystem at the time wasn't very mature. So trying to write a web server that wasn't like threaded or didn't have any standard library traits to lean on in this area was tricky, right?
with all these kind of tricky bits, like you still felt okay that you guys can use Rust as this authentication piece?
Yeah, the real key is that it was hard to write, but then you had confidence once you had written it that it was going to do what you expected, which obviously for an auth system is pretty vital.
What year was this that you guys were starting to look at this?
I think 2019.
No, it's not too long time ago. I feel like 2019 was just yesterday with all this pandemic crap stuff going on. Yeah, so 2019, I mean, like, so you just kind of said, hey, why don't we consider to break out the authentication piece and use Rust for that? Like, how did that topic come up?
There was definitely problems with it. Like we didn't have persistent sessions. So the question was, do we implement persistent sessions, like Redis backend into the current monolith, or do we break this out with the thinking of more bits are going to be broken out of the monolith? So we're probably going to need some kind of API gateway or service at some point. For various reasons, like industry specific reasons, we decided with the auth service approach versus off the shelf API gateway or anything like that.
And was there any pushback from people saying like, no, this is too niche technology, or we don't need so high? No, everybody was just like, let's go all in. Like, I love the idea of Rust. Let's just do it.
I think we were all pretty interested in Rust, just, what's the word? Not socially. What am I trying to say? We'd all seen it and like understood that it had the potential to become something interesting. And I guess the team was too small at that time to really have any pushback on it.
Oh, how many people were there at the time? Can you say?
Maybe 8 devs, yeah.
Oh, it's still rather large. I think that's huge for my side. I don't think I've ever been in a team that's larger than 5, including the manager.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, so like a
Yeah.
lot of the companies I work with, they really pride on. Well, one is that they're usually low budget, and two is that, how do I say this? They pride themselves on having small teams because it's easier to work, right? Because you just do fast iterations and start, adding stuff up. But 8 is also okay.
Yeah, it's a lot different now. The startup I started working for got acquired by the exchange I'm now a part of. And it's something like 2,000 people in total, maybe 400 devs across like 8 teams or something. So it's really grown a lot in my sort of career. It's just absolutely been exponential.
I want to get back to this topic because there's some more stuff that's interesting to talk about that. But let's kind of finish up about like you guys' first experience. So like, were you the only person at the time that had experience with Rust, or was anybody else playing around with it at the time?
No one had real experience with Rust, and we were a startup, so we could kind of get away with it. I think everybody had reasonably heard of it, but there were some sort of Java zealots there that were like trying to hold on to their enterprise software. Again, it wasn't really pushback. It was just sort of, well, we could just write it in Java, or we could use this newfangled thing. But that answers the question.
No, I was just kind of curious about like if anybody else was playing around with Rust at the time, or was like everybody totally new and you're the only one who actually at least played with it. Not even talk about production experience yet.
After the proposal for the auth service, somebody else started creating a different thing in Rust using Rocket, and he seemed to get up to speed pretty quickly. So it's possible he had some experience, but yeah, again, it was the language was new and we were a new team, so
it's quite a gamble. Like there was nobody in management. We have stuff in Java already. We better not rock the boat. There was no pushback like that at all.
Not that I remember, but I don't know particularly. Again, I was a front end guy at the time saying, "Hey, let's write an auth service in Rust," which may have seemed, like in hindsight, that must have seemed pretty strange. I came up with a real plan, and it seemed doable in a short amount of time. Like, they wouldn't be wasting 3 months trying to make this thing. It'd have an immediate win for business goal. So I guess that's how you pass things, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Like one is I like to ask the question, how kind of Rust came in? What was the pushback like? Because I think that's good for people to have, because there's going to be always fanboys like, let's do this in Rust and not have a legitimate reason. But then there's also going to be people who do have a legitimate reason, and they still have to go through these hurdles of saying like, okay, management's going to say this. How can I give justification? And I think us saying that we already have so much stuff written in Java, why should we be now adding another language, especially something that's new to everybody over here? That is going to be a huge pushback, right?
Yeah.
For smart management, it will be a good argument. Yeah, but like, how did you defeat that argument? It sounds like you didn't.
I think
have
it's
any
because
argument.
we didn't really like it. I don't think anybody really liked what was there, and the guy who wrote all of it originally had already upped and left, or whatever the case was by the time I'd gotten there. So we wanted to split things out, and the question was just like, how are we going to split them out? Do we write another thing in Java, or do we explore other languages and other frameworks that seem like they suit us better? because we have like real concrete reasons why Java wasn't a good starting point, except for everyone knows it. It's used to write a lot of enterprise software, which is kind of where the management at the time had come from.
Yeah, I've been in many of those startups where they manage, where they, a lot of these, there's quite a bit of startups that come up from these guys who are in enterprise, like you said, and then they have a startup and they're like, well, it works in the company, so it must be good. Well, also your company has got like hundreds of people working in a bank where you have to justify and get support from Oracle,
Right.
etc. Right?
Yeah.
So not
Yeah.
even close, in my opinion.
Yep.
Okay, so you guys threw the service up, you went through your hurdles, and you threw it up. And how was the performance? How was your expectations? Were they met? Were they under? Because maybe you guys were still getting used to it, or what happened?
My perspective coming from Node was I was blown away, sort of doing load testing on some of these bits for signing in and verifying tokens and stuff. It was just like, wow, we can do how many verifications a second? This is incredible. Like the latency was so much lower than I'd ever expected. Like we didn't even bother in Node land measuring latencies less than a millisecond. And suddenly I'm seeing like 2-digit microseconds of latency for things. And that was kind of extraordinary for slightly younger me. I'll say there was a little more pushback thinking about it. After we got acquired, the discussion of Rust had come up again in terms of the wider group adopting some of it and rewriting bits for them. And I think they had a much harder time because of management decisions, and they had a lot more code to rewrite and a lot more nasty behaviors to like re-implement, I suppose. And I do remember a lot of like C++ zealotry at the time.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that one. I wanted to ask more about the others, but I feel like I'm going to go in that, talk about old stuff that's not important now. But
Yeah.
let's actually talk about that part. So you wrote your software, you got acquired, and then you said, what was the other side? They kind of came in and they said, okay, what are you guys using? And we said, okay, we're using Rust. Probably still had some Java, I'm guessing at the time. You said Rust was a big problem for them.
It was certainly a bigger problem. I didn't really have too much to do with that team, but you hear stories within a group of teams about other guys who've been doing C++ for 20 years and are like, this is ideal. We can use this to build whatever we need to. Like, this is less in terms of building web services. This is more like core trading engine functionality. And I don't think, I might be wrong, but I don't think they've broken through that hurdle yet. There isn't the real immediate benefit to doing so at this point. So you don't get that through management unless there is really, I think.
For the new company, you guys must have, so you said you have some C++, is that what I heard correctly?
Yeah.
And Rust and Java, I suppose.
Yeah. The different teams are reasonably autonomous. There isn't a core authority on what we should use throughout the whole company. And I like that because the silos can more or less operate independently as long as we have some like common interface for talking to each other.
Now, is there anybody from the C++ side or other communities that kind of came over and said, hey, you guys are using Rust, how is it? We're thinking about switching or you adopting it?
There's definitely been those discussions, but I think it was above my pay grade at the time.
Okay, I'm just kind of curious if anybody reached out. And then, so maybe we can talk more about getting towards the actual work. I think it's probably better. I feel like there's not much more to say about this topic. So you chose Actix Web. I mean, there wasn't much other choices according to you at the time. You think this is the best choice at the time. But at the time when you started using it, Actix Web was actually using Actix at its core, which is no longer true for some time.
That is true. Yeah.
So, like, I don't know. I don't even know where to start with this one. Like, can we talk a little bit about this? Like, what was the changes and why?
So, of course, you see this come up time and time again, not as a question, but as an assumption from people like, oh, Actix Web uses Actix under the hood. And it's like, that hasn't been true since version 1.0, which is a very long time in the past and like even before my time as a contributor to the project. So what we got was better asynchronous support from the language and from libraries. So it was rebuilt on top of this new architecture because we fundamentally didn't need the actors anymore. For the core web server part, it wasn't required. Now, they're still required for WebSockets, but that's because we haven't put the time into changing the interface for it yet. And they're actually a reasonably elegant way of doing WebSockets, but that is the only part where you really need the actors still.
I'm still like, I think I want to talk a little bit about the changes, right? So you joined when it was still Actix was at the core, and obviously you must have been privy to why Actix was taken out and why. I mean, you guys are not still using the actor model, are you?
No, not at all. So I'd read some research on the what's called the service architecture. I don't remember what this was, but I'm almost certain it was an academic paper describing some sort of interface that you could use to model these asynchronous interactions. And it turned out to be a much cleaner and a nicer model than using actors for this. So Actix uses this architecture throughout it. And if you've implemented a middleware, that is, the traits service, the service trait is what you're implementing. Tower uses a very similar trait, or like almost identical these days. So they have their version, we have our version, but we sort of agreed that this is a good idea from two different angles.
All right, that's interesting. Okay, I was always kind of curious why you guys switched from it because I I think you probably heard me before, but I use a lot of Elixir for my
Mm,
backends, and
right.
the actor model is kind of key to it. And so, like, if
Mm,
you think about every request being a separate actor, separate process, or whatever, it really makes a lot of sense. But why you guys rip it out is like, I wonder why they did that because it just makes so much more sense in this language,
right.
and that was core of what it was before. So it's like it takes effort to actually change a lot of stuff around for a good reason.
Yeah. I think really the core reason was that Actix was a really good early async runtime, effectively, or at least a wrapper over Tokyo version 0.1. Again, I'm fuzzy on this because I wasn't part of the team at the time, but like the way I understand it is that Tokyo 0.1 had some issues with, in particular, their multi-threaded like work stealing mode, which they largely fixed in 0.2. But that's also the time that we got the standard future trait. So implementing the full stack from runtime up to web framework is like such a gigantic task, and it was effectively just Nicolay working on it almost by himself. So I think he sort of probably saw some pressure. In my position there, I would have seen some pressure to offload some of the work over to Tokyo a bit more, stop trying to re-implement every part of the stack.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what I know. Again, it's before my time.
Okay. So, how did you end up getting really, really involved in the Actix Web framework then?
When the leadership changed hands, John Titer on GitHub took over after Nicolay left. And it was sort of at that point that we had this new round of contributors come in. And effectively, it was the people who said, we'd like to fork the project that then came back and said, okay, cool, the project is alive. We can just contribute to it now. And I think I just put my hand up and said, hey, I'd like to work on this a bit more. And so I got assigned core contributor access, which meant I could merge things into master. And I think I kept submitting PRs, they kept getting merged. And at some point, John Tita was just like, effectively running this now, that's fine. Here's the core role. So now you can publish to Crates.io. I kept contributing and it kept working.
And then at some point, I think somebody must have stepped down because you got stepped up, no?
I think it was just a natural transition. Like I was asking for crate publishers more often than they were available, and so I got assigned this, and then I basically just said, like, I almost took it on myself to provide the direction and the vision for the project, and everyone seemed okay with it. So that's sort of where we are. I think if you just like are passionate about things in open source and you get involved heavily, you'll be able to get to that sort of point, especially if there's a major change in leadership at one point or another.
Yeah, I feel like there's been some huge changes. I mean, I think when I started looking at Actix Web, it was it two or something? I don't remember, but I do remember there was like a huge kind of I don't know. I felt in the community there was like a huge like relief when Actix Web started getting more commits, and also like you said, it was turned over to the community to work on. The guy kind of bowed out, and it seemed like it was rapid amount of versions coming out for a while,
Yeah.
and then now we're at 4. But it seems like every version is really different, right? From 1 to 2, there's quite some changes. 2
Mhm.
to 3 also seemed like there's quite a bit of changes too, and then now 4 was even more changes now.
Yeah, I think maybe the jump from 1 to 2 was probably the biggest of the major version bumps. In If you take the strict definition of how Rust libraries work, like Actix Web shouldn't be version 1 even, because it exposes interfaces from unstable crates. So part of the reason that we need to have version bumps is that some of these libraries that we expose doing version bumps themselves, like Rust TLS, for instance, is not version 1, and the HTTP crate, which we use for method and version types and stuff like that, So we will need to publish breaking changes. It's just a case of deciding what else to bundle in when we need to make those changes.
So 1 to 2 was basically handling the 0 to like if we were to like talk about what the major changes were that really make a difference. I mean, of course, there's a lot more than just this, but I'm just kind of curious about how would you state from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4.
Right. So I guess point 7 to 1 was really dropping actors and starting to rely a bit more on Tokyo. 1 to 2 was adopting the standard future trait, which had before only been in the futures crate. So yeah, adopting that and the future 0.3 ecosystem of stuff. 2 to 3, when I sort of got involved, and that was around the time that there was a lot of concern about unsafe in the library. There were some breaking changes necessary to get that all fixed. So again, we had to decide then what else to put in the breaking release for version 3, along with all the fixes for unsafe stuff. But there isn't really a key feature of version 3 that I can pull out of my head. And then version 3 to version 4 is really the Tokyo V1 support and all that ecosystem that's been developed over the last sort of year and a bit.
It's interesting because Tokyo 1's been out for a while now.
Yeah,
That you guys are finally. What was the holdup? Sorry, I must talk about this one for a second.
Yeah, no, definitely been a tumultuous sort of beta period. I think the first beta was that added Tokyo V1 support was February 2021, I think. So there's been almost as many point releases of Tokyo as there's been betas for Actix Web V4, which a lot of people will know and be frustrated with. And I can only apologize to those people.
That must have been a huge endeavor that it took so long. Is that what happened?
Yeah, some of it was waiting. Like, again, I'm not going to like shed blame on other people, but there were some libraries that we wanted to get integrated. I think the ones that come to mind are Rust TLS 0.20 and Cookie had a new version published that we had to wait a little bit for. But apart from that, a lot of it really was like my indecision of what to put in. And this is something that I'd like to sort of put my head down and write my thoughts down about this and maybe publish a blog about, what took so long and how to not do that again.
Yeah, I mean, if I heard correctly, you can let me know if I misunderstood. Uh, Definitely part of it that took so long was actually dependencies not being quite yet ready, or you're waiting for certain features from those dependencies to actually drop in order to bump those.
That's not the majority of the time in beta, but definitely was part of it. Like, I may have pulled the trigger sooner if they were sort of ready at the same time I was or whatever. But then we took advantage of having to wait to do some other things, and then that turned into, oh wait, these other things need more time in beta. So it was kind of a knock-on effect there. A large amount of it was just I was indecisive about what to do some of the time. And really, if I look back now, the key thing I should have done differently is release version 4 in like March 2021, and the feature would have just been Tokyo V1 support, and that's it. And then focused on these API refinements and everything else that we did after that. And my mindset at the time was that I can forge Actix Web into this perfect framework, and it just wasn't the case, and still isn't the case. And I really had to, at the end of the beta period, put a real feature freeze, if you want to sort of use the industry term, and say, right, no more. This is in testing, bug fixes only. Like, I need to rein myself in because I don't have a manager to do that for me in open source land.
Okay, that's interesting. So you actually had to say, okay, enough features, now let's stabilize everything, right?
Right. I wanted to target long-term support, right? In the same vein as Tokyo V1 said, right, we're providing long-term support. We have a minimal interface. They took stuff out of version 1, right? And they were kind of painful to take out, but they said, right, this is how we're going to provide a lot of support. And that, I really took that to heart at the time. I thought, cool, we can build Actix Web to do the same thing. And there's just all the factors that listed above just combined to make it not quite possible this time.
How do you feel about, like, do you know when there'll be a version 5, or is there just going to be 4.1, 4.2
Right.
coming up?
So the conversation's come up recently about Hyper's V1 stabilization, and sort of a subtask of that is the HTTP crate stabilization. So the next time I can see there being a breaking release for us is when that gets bumped to V1, and we'll have to update our types as well, or rather our re-exports of those types.
I'm surprised you just don't match, like, you just don't have like wrappers around them, like interfaces that abstract away from some of this.
That's just like, it's overhead for the maintainers, right? Especially for some of these things. Like, we want to be able to use these types as they are, especially these sort of like core primitives.
So if you were to describe Actix Web versus other kinds of different web frameworks in the Rust community, right? So what comes to mind? I think there's Axiom, there's Warp.
Right.
I mean, Rocket's kind of clear, right? That one's batteries included, like you said, very opinionated.
Yeah.
It's
I
totally
don't feel
different.
like Rocket's very popular.
You can't compare.
Yeah, it's not quite on the same scope.
But I think the other ones are very comparable now.
Yeah, I think over the years we've experimented with some stuff, and I think Warp is a great example of an experimentation that can provide a nice interface for some people used to specific paradigms and be tricky for others. But it's good that we have that choice. I think if you were to say what's different about Actix Web, I mean, primarily it doesn't use hyper, which I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear that. I guess the assumption is all the base libraries are using hyper, right? We use the same primitive types as hyper, but we don't use that for the actual implementation of HTTP. And people will say, well, why not just use hyper? And I think there's value in having multiple implementations of this within an ecosystem. In particular, I think about the times in Node when there was, or other languages that provide these kind of things as a standard library, and think, okay, well, when they get a CVE, like a vulnerability reported, you effectively have to update your language in order to fix yourself from these vulnerabilities. And there's been cases in the past where we've had vulnerabilities reported on Actix Web that don't apply to hyper, and vice versa, right? If you understand what the stack is of an application, it's not immediately obvious that something is vulnerable to something. And like, say the split is half and half, right, between hyper and Actix HTTP, then if there's a vulnerability, only half the people are vulnerable. And I think we have some flexibility, and we're able to make decisions about these things that probably wouldn't make it into hyper's thing if we did use it. So not using hyper is kind of here to stay.
You're going to make some people very upset that you're using Tokyo but not hyper for HTTP.
That's understandable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's a little bit ballsy, right? Because, yeah, we kind of talked a little bit about, hey, we want to build upon what people are already using, right? Similar with Node.js kind of thing. Let's use what's already out there. But you guys are like, no, we don't want to use that one. But we're going to be very similar, but not the same. Is there any benefits or negatives in association with that? Because this is a huge one, right? Basically, it's like you said, that's the base for everybody. You have to use hyper.
I think there's lower hanging fruit to tackle first. There's sort of 4 ecosystems of HTTP in the ecosystem in Rust that I can see. So there's clearly something wrong with the underlying abstractions that we can't all agree on, even like an interface for reading bytes from a stream currently, which is pretty fundamental to any sort of networking protocol. I think it was quite ballsy of Nicolay to make that decision in the first place, to write his own implementation. But it's a decision I definitely respect, and which is why I'd like to carry it on. Like, I want to understand this stuff and be able to like debug this protocol and make changes and optimizations and stuff like that, right? I'm not to say that ours is better. It's just different. It has different goals, I think.
So one thing I did want to ask too is that, so you guys really stepped away from Actix, but you're still using Actix for WebSocket, right? And you said that at some point you probably will replace that. Is Actix actually still being maintained? Because like I kind of seen some uptick and then also seen it's kind of stalled. I don't know. Maybe I didn't check at the right time.
No, it's in passive maintenance mode. It's not something that I'm particularly interested in developing actively and adding features to. I think version bumps are pretty much just keeping up with underlying libraries. We've done some work trying to integrate it a bit better with the modern sort of async await ecosystem of stuff. It's just not possible to do in a safe way and keep the limited ergonomics that exist with Actix. Who knows? Maybe when we get async traits, we'll look at it again.
Well, I find it really interesting that you guys, if you go to actix.rx, I think that used to be like a catch-all for all different Actix projects. Now it seems only Actix Web.
Yep.
Which is very interesting. Instead of saying like actixweb.rs.
That's a decision that I've slowly been making over time to reduce the amount of times that we even talk about actors, just because there is this confusion and misconception around what the base of Actix Web is. Like, the thing that I'm interested in developing and the thing that is most useful to people is the web framework. In the modern landscape of async Rust, actors aren't needed 99.9% of the time. Like, there are very few situations you can't model with just async tasks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, what I do like about Actix Web is that you can define the data that you want to accept with a struct, and it just magically works. That was super attractive to me. Because the thing is, you don't know what you're going to get, right? But
Yep.
with this one, you can really, and I like this thing that you can use either for JSON or form, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that was just an idea I had. I'm not sure of how many people are actually using it or if it's even discoverable, but it's kind of a nice interface if you're wanting to be polymorphic about like format of requests. You know, you can accept a URL encoded form or a JSON form, and they both just work. So with the designs that I come up with for Actix Web, I try and lean on this word we use in our marketing, pragmatic. I try and think about what people really need to use in practice and what is most useful, even if it comes at a cost. So, like, for example, this either type is a lot more overhead than most of the other extractors. But to model this in a different way or to write this code in a different way yourself is like, it's a pain, right? You want these things to be built in. You want them to be easy to use if you need it.
Not to mention, you could also kind of theoretically use this in multiple routes, right? So that's also quite interesting.
What do you mean?
Oh, I mean, like, let's say you have a static page with a form on it, and then you also have JSON API. Two different routes
Right.
put to the same function.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of decisions like that that I try and make personally.
Has there been anything where it's like you're like, let's do this, and everybody else is like, no, that's not a good idea at all?
There's definitely been some churn in the betas because of those kind of things. It's not always obvious from writing tests that something is difficult to use. And it's not always obvious from the perspective of an expert in using the framework that it's difficult to use or find out how to use it from a beginner's perspective. So yeah, that probably constituted like a quarter of the churn in the beta period is me making some bad decisions and reversing them.
Yeah, but I think that's fine, right? Because they're betas, and people.
Yeah.
Were people actually upgrading to the betas and actually trying them out and giving you serious feedback? Or because the only thing that I see a lot of is like,
Yeah.
I see a lot of people say, okay, this is RC, right? If this is good, then we're going to release it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they release it. And then like a couple days later, okay, this is X.0.1 because people didn't actually try the damn thing, which is the most annoying part, right?
Yeah. I think people did upgrade in the beta period, but sort of at some point it stopped being acceptable to use Tokyo 0.2 stuff. So like people who needed version 1 were like, okay, well, the answer is you need to use the beta. Like, I'm sorry, but we can't just put Tokyo V1 inside version 3 of Actix Web. So
yeah, I don't think I have a lot to ask. I think maybe can we talk a little bit about like what's in the immediate future for Actix Web?
Yeah, I think probably a couple of the point releases largely planned out feature-wise, and that's been pretty nice to be able to experiment. I made a crate called Actix Web Lab, which is where I sort of dumped some of the PRs that are open after the feature freeze was sort of put in place, and we've been able to iterate on those a little bit in a crate that can be updated and sort of never will hit version 1. It's been kind of getting back to more of the fun stuff and bouncing ideas around for what to do in the future.
Yeah. Is there anything you wanted to say before we start to sign off? Because I'm really running out of questions. I think it's quite clear, and I really love the website. Makes it very clear how to use it.
Mm-hmm. Consider Actix Web for your next web project. I'd love to hear feedback on anything, especially beginners.
Yeah, definitely. I think your website's great. I love the fact that you guys have like very simple, easy to understand how the stuff can do. The API is super, and just 1, 2, 3, 4. Was it like 5 to 10 lines of code? You have something that's very, very simple.
Right. Yep. We're not chasing 3-line hello worlds. That's not it should be very clear. It should be very no magic, like what's going on.
I think the only question I have is when is HTTP 3 coming out?
H3. It's not top of my list. I think there needs to be some more experimentation with lower level libraries at the minute. It's definitely an exciting protocol upgrade, and it's going to make a lot of things much quicker. And it opens up the door for some other interesting like web APIs, like web transport, which could be a viable replacement for WebSockets in a few like key areas like gaming and finance.
Okay.
Yeah, the future's bright.
I think also there's very few people still implementing H2 is already huge and pretty similar to H3.
We see new libraries for H3. I think it's just trying to find out what the right interface for it is, just because of how fundamentally different the lower level parts are. We're not quite sure how to do that properly yet. Again, I haven't really looked into it too much, but that's my view from 1,000 feet.
Yeah. So if you guys haven't, check out Actix Web. Actix Web 4 seems to be pretty decent. I haven't gotten a chance to give it a try, but yeah, I mean, just from the highlights and from chatting with you, and I think it's pretty solid stuff. If you guys are looking for a good guide, I think Luca's book is an awesome guide for how you can really do some pretty cool stuff, zero to production. There was quite about like every time, it seemed like every week or so, like he had to keep rewriting parts of the book because of the changes. But yeah, don't be upset. It's okay. I mean, now you guys are kind of stable, right? So it's been less updates.
Yeah, I've definitely kept in touch with Luca. His book is incredible. I got a copy and was providing feedback in some of the early stages, but he's been an absolute champion keeping it up to date.
So because you guys are pretty close, there wasn't anything like, hey man, can you please stop giving me so much work? I'm trying to finish this book.
Yeah, I mean, he's in London as well, so we've talked about it over a pint, and sort of ribbed me a little bit for for being so long in beta. But
okay, I thought he was just like, because there's so many changes he had to keep making, he was just upset. Like, come on, man, stop. Just give me a break here.
Yeah, I think just occasionally I was just like, now's a good time to update that, I promise. And then the next week I was like, oh, sorry, man.
Oh, that must be very awkward, but I guess a pint would settle that problem.
Yeah. I owe you a pint. It's a very good way of getting out of things in the UK.
Okay, I always heard that sit down for a cup of tea was a big thing. I think pint makes a little bit more sense. All right. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate hearing from Actix Web, and it's good to hear, kind of a short history of what happened. You can't get away from that, like you said before the show. You search on YouTube, you're going to find this coming up. But way long time ago, things have since changed quite a lot. That's a pretty solid framework. Pretty surprising to hear that you guys don't actually use Hyper, but use what makes the most sense for you guys. And otherwise, I think, I'm still undecided where I want to go. If I want to go to Warp or Actix Web, but I feel like Actix Web has got such a history that's hard not to look at it. I have no problem. I don't care about Hyper. I just want to write something, right? Nobody really cares too much about underlying
that's
stuff.
it. Like, people don't really care what's running it to an extent.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Again,
Thanks
really
for having me.
appreciate it. Have a good day. Good night.